The Gospel lesson from John. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name.
Would you pray with me? We rejoice with glad hearts today, O God, at the Easter blessings we've been granted. Now open our minds and hearts to the Spirit of the risen Christ, present with us today. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts please you. Amen. Well, as you are all well aware, we have very limited parking around our church, which poses some special challenges for us, especially on high attendance Sundays like Easter. So we've developed a diligent and very committed parking volunteer team. And they help with this problem. They do a terrific job. One Easter a few years ago, you may have heard about an interesting incident, however, related to one of these volunteer parkers. They were out in full force that day wearing the orange vests and carrying walkie-talkies and trying to make the parking process just as seamless as possible. The major challenge for the parking team was going to be helping the cars exchange spots between services. Well, as you might imagine, the spots nearest to the sanctuary, right around this perimeter, were filled well before the second service was ready to begin. When one of the parking volunteers noticed that one lone car was backing out of a really prime spot. And he was delighted to see that the next car approaching him into the turn-in in his part of the lot was driven by an older woman who was alone, and he thought, well, how wonderful, I'm going to be able to help her get this really desirable parking spot on Easter. So he began enthusiastically waving her in from the street, right into the lot as you might direct a plane towards its airport gate. And at first the woman seemed a little confused heading into what was apparently a full lot, so he just increased the waving and pointing so she would see where he wanted her to go. Such a prime spot. Well, she finally pulls in and parks, and our proud and happy parking volunteer walks to the car to wish her happy Easter and help her out. But she rolled down the window, still looking confused, and she sputters, "I don't go to this church. I've been a Baptist for 70 years. I love that. Have you ever felt like that? Like you got guided and maneuvered and parked someplace you really weren't sure you wanted to be. Maybe you feel you've been parked in some location, parked in a job, parked in an idea that hasn't really taken you where you wanted or needed to go. Truth is, I think a lot of us have been taught notions or beliefs and then parked our minds there, when maybe we ought to have kept searching, kept going. For example, haven't most of us parked our minds already around the understandings of who Jesus' disciple Thomas was? The one we hear about in our scripture text for today. We know him, most of us, as Doubting Thomas. I was taught to call him that in my Sunday school days. Thomas doubted Jesus' resurrection, and we must not, under any circumstances, be like doubting Thomas, right? But you know, the older I've become, the more I've observed and experienced, the more I dislike being maneuvered into that parking place. And the more I want to revise my opinion of Thomas. In fact, there are 3 things I want to point out about this old, familiar doubting Thomas story today that I hope will keep us from parking our beliefs prematurely about him and his legacy to us. The first thing that I hope we'll see in this story about Thomas is that doubt is not actually such a bad thing. In fact, as Dr. Bill Self says, I must admit that there is a place for doubt in the Christian life, for honest doubt is always a prelude to faith. Think about that. If you review the lives of the great prophets and saints, from Jeremiah to Mother Teresa, you'll find plenty of evidence of doubt. It's not uncommon at all. It's there in all the greatest and most faithful of lives, and I've actually begun to wonder if perhaps you can't really possess the fullness of a great and vigorous faith until, through doubt, you've examined it, and you've struggled with it, and you've worked for it. It's been said that Jesus himself was a doubter from a certain perspective. At least he knew how to employ doubt creatively in the life of faith. He doubted that long prayers and rigidary dietary laws and cleanliness codes of his religious tradition were essential to faith. So he talked about practicing an honest, simpler, trusting faith. He doubted that Samaritans were of less inherent worth than others and that positions of honor were necessarily merited. So he told the parable about the Good Samaritan and the neglectful priest. He doubted that anger and retribution were ways to solve differences and establish the reign of peace he sought, so he said, forgive one another. So yes, maybe the capacity to doubt is the prelude to establishing vital, meaningful faith commitments. So let me ask you, have you had the privilege of doubting, of struggling with a few faith-shaping doubts of your own? I hope so. I think most of us have, and so I think we ought to also have some sympathy and respect for Thomas. The biblical story of Thomas is found only in the Gospel of John, and by the time the writer of John's Gospel records this story, it's from a distance of some 70 years or so after Jesus' death and resurrection. And this was a time in which Jewish and Gentile Christians were experiencing tremendous persecution from Rome. Certainly, those early Christians were doubtful, frequently, about the wisdom of having adopted this faith. The risks to them were great, and many of them were tempted to go into hiding for their own self-protection. So now, with that backdrop, we can see why the author of John's Gospel would have felt it particularly meaningful to tell the story of the very first group of Jesus' followers who, after the crucifixion, were also doubtful about their futures and tempted to go into hiding. They were all huddled in that upper room, locked away behind securely closed doors, and that's when we encountered Thomas. You know the story. He had ventured out from the closed room one day, and he missed Jesus' appearance among the disciples. And when he returns to the room, he refused to believe what the other disciples had to say and their assertions that the risen Christ had been there. And why was he doubtful? Now, this is critical to the story. And it leads us to the second point I want us to see, which is just this. Thomas is doubtful, and he says he will not believe until he can see and touch for himself. In other words, Thomas wants proof in the form of empirical verification. Well, what's wrong with that? Wouldn't you want proof? In our scientific age, we've all been trained to verify through sensory experience, empirical evidence. So Thomas actually stands as something like a pivotal figure in the Christian story, precisely because while all the disciples before him did get to see and touch and hear Jesus directly, the millions of us who come after Thomas don't have that opportunity. So you see, a new phase, a new stage of church life and faith begins with this story of Thomas. Thomas stands at a transition point. But I want you to notice how Jesus responds to Thomas's demand for proof. He doesn't rebuke him for wanting it. Indeed, Jesus gives him what he needs for faith. He lets him touch, he lets him see. And then Jesus goes on to say, for the benefit of all of us who'll follow Thomas and hear about this story, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Now that line is intended for us, of course. We who cannot see, cannot verify, cannot amass proof, and yet we're still invited into the blessings of faith in Jesus Christ nonetheless. So perhaps we ought to ask ourselves today, how is it possible for us to believe if we won't get what the disciples and ultimately Thomas got? Ask yourself, what's the basis of your belief? Have you had an experience, some insight? Have you read something, heard something, witnessed something? What? How can you believe, especially when maybe like Thomas, you've already been disappointed or disillusioned, and the last thing you want to do is to foolishly believe in another impossibility? Is belief in something you cannot fully verify just wishful thinking? Is it just grasping at straws? I love the story of Father Henry Nouwen. He shared about an experience that he had had that helped him with this question. Nouwen was a great fan of the Flying Rodleys, who were German trapeze artists. Nouwen, a Catholic priest, says that he greatly admired these acrobats, and they actually befriended him and even let him practice with them on the trapeze. Once, Nouwen recalls, he asked the leader of the troupe about flying through the air. And he said, "As a flyer, I must have complete trust in my catcher. The public might think that I am the great star of the trapeze, but the real star is Joe, the catcher. He has to be there for me with split-second precision and grab me out of the air. And I have simply to stretch out my arms and hands and wait for him to catch me. The worst thing that a flyer can do," he said, "is to try to catch the catcher. A flyer must fly, and the catcher must catch, and the flyer must trust with outstretched arms that his catcher will be there for him." Don't we live, all of us, like the flyer on the trapeze? We're spinning and we're swirling through life, and we're unable to see where we're headed. We can't touch or see or prove the existence of a catcher who won't let us fall. But nevertheless, we must learn to reach out our hands and believe that we'll be safely caught and held. Blessed are those who cannot see and yet have come to believe. Because sometimes reaching out in faith, unseeingly but trustingly, is really the only way open to us. True, we may not get the empirical proof we'd like, the kind that Thomas demanded, but really, we don't have that kind of proof for any of the things that are most important to us, do we? How can we conclusively prove the love of a spouse, the friendship of a dear one, the hope that sustains? We can't. But we know they exist, we feel them, and day by day and even moment by moment, we need to hold out our hands and just trust we're going to receive them. And that leads me to the third point I hope we'll see in this story of Thomas. It's about the imperative of staying near to our friends in faith. Thomas had lost his trust. You see, he couldn't reach out. He couldn't reach out in faithfulness, in confidence to anyone. Did you notice that Thomas missed seeing Jesus in the first place because he'd left the room where all the other disciples had gathered? He'd left the others. But he was granted all he needed for belief when he came back and stood among his fellow disciples. And I'm beginning to think that maybe that's the most important part of what this gospel story is teaching us. That we will find the assurance we need for belief most readily here in the fellowship of others. And if we're to brand Thomas as having been faithless, then his faithlessness didn't lie only in doubting Jesus' resurrection. His faithlessness also lay in his unwillingness to stay with his friends and trust and believe with them and in them. And that's always a problem. Reverend King Duncan once told a story of a 97-year-old woman he knew who, looking back, said she learned the most important lesson in her life when she was just a young child. She and a group of friends had decided one afternoon to climb Mount Washington in New Hampshire. But before they were able to descend, a late afternoon fog rolled in and it just enveloped them all in a thick, obscuring whiteness. They couldn't see the way ahead. And so they agreed that the only way down was inch by inch, very slowly down that mountainside, and they agreed that they would all hold hands and they would not, under any circumstances, let go of one another. Remembering the event years later, the woman said of this experience, "Sometimes all I could see was the hand ahead of me, the one that I held, and the hand behind me that held me. And sometimes my arms ached so badly I thought I would cry out loud, but that's how we made it at last. We found our way home by holding on to one another." What a metaphor. What a metaphor that is for the significance of maintaining durable, trusting relationships with other searching and faithful people. Of course, we'll still undergo challenges, the same that those girls on the mountainside did. Sometimes we'll get lost. Sometimes we'll be strained to stay together, strained by our differences, though we share a faith. Sometimes we'll be unwilling or unable to trust what the others ahead are telling us or to credit their insights. But if we hang together, we can cover some pretty rough terrain safely and securely. You know, I find myself today feeling honored. I'm honored to be part of the Church Universal that keeps trying to hang together. And I'm equally proud to be part of my own church family. So often I have witnessed somebody reach out, take a hand, grab hold of somebody in danger of being lost or alone or falling. I've watched as you, church members, have sat beside grieving families at funerals just to offer a touch of comfort. I've seen you, Christ's people, bring flowers to hospitalized church members or communion to shut-ins. I've seen you build houses for Habitat for Humanity and mentor youth and tutor children and serve the homeless and plan for the giving and sustaining faith and hope to generations to follow you. I've watched you open your hearts and your wallets over the years to victims now of several hurricanes, a tsunami, and an earthquake, and never begrudge the money spent on behalf of others. Yes, I've watched. I've watched your diligence as Christ's people in staying close together to one another for good in these ways and in 1,000 other ways besides across the years, trusting that all that effort and irritation and expense was worth it. And what's the payoff? It's that being in one another's company, doing the work of faith together, is where we all encounter the healing, loving, breathing Spirit of Christ. Thomas learned that when he came back to the upper room and encountered the risen Christ with the others. So Thomas, the proof seeker, doesn't deserve to be parked in that dismal and unredeemable category of doubter, I don't think. Because do you know what happens after the scene we read about today? Do you know what Thomas does next? He gets up out of that locked room where he and the others had found the proof they needed of Christ's Spirit alive and well, and then he goes out to serve in that Spirit, tradition tells us, until his death, fearlessly and with utter conviction. So actually, Thomas has become something of a hero for me. He had the tenacity to seek until he found, and then the courage to live the rest of his life fully trusting in the glory and grace of God that he glimpsed that day. What a gift that kind of faithful courage can be to the end. Bishop William Willimon tells of once visiting a man with only a couple days left to live, and he asked the man whether he was afraid. To Willimon's surprise, the man replied firmly, "Fear? No, I'm not fearful, because of my faith in Jesus." And then the man continued, "I look back over my life," he said, "all the mistakes I've made, all the times I've turned away from Jesus, gone my own way, strayed and gotten lost, time again. He found a way to get to me. He looked for me when I wasn't even looking for him. I don't think he'll let something like my dying defeat his love for me." What could get in the way of God's love for you? What? Closed doors? Doubts? Demands? No, of course not. Illness, hardship, failings, and mistakes? No, surely not. Nothing can separate you from God's love. And so, the challenge is then to trust in that, live in light of that, to stretch out our hands and be caught by it, even when we cannot always see it or touch it. Maybe today, in remembrance of blustering Thomas, we all just ought to widen our standards of proof a bit to encompass the truth of all the wondrous ways God's love already has and is and will continue to come to us until we can say with joyful conviction, "All I have seen teaches me to trust God for all I have not yet seen." Let's not let ourselves get steered into any other smaller conclusion. Let's not settle for parking our minds and beliefs anywhere else than in the assurance of God's vast, eternal, and unconquerable love for us all. Amen.